Welcome to the Montclair History Center's History at Home presentation tonight. I'm going to just get started very briefly with some introductions and just a little housekeeping for this evening. And then we will turn it over to our guest presenters tonight, which we are so excited to have doing this partnership program with the Montclair Art Museum. So tonight, we are so glad to welcome multimedia artist Holly Wilson and curator of Native American art at the Montclair Art Museum, Laura Allen. So tonight, Laura will discuss Montclair Art Museum's exhibition and collection work of regional Native art, and Holly will also be sharing her wide-ranging practice in sculpture, photography, ceramics, glass, and how she integrates this her research on generations of family who were displaced from this land. So I just want to tell you a little bit more about Holly and Laura, who are joining us this evening. So Holly, who is a multimedia artist, creates figures as her storytellers, conveying stories of the sacred and the precious, capturing moments of our day, vulnerabilities, and strengths. So she has exhibited her work since the early 1990s in group and solo exhibitions, and has received numerous awards, grants, and fellowships. Wilson's work is part of national and international collections. She holds a Master's of Fine Arts in Sculpture, a Master of Arts in Ceramics, as well as a BFA in Ceramics and a teaching certification in K-12 education. Laura J. Allen is an interdisciplinary scholar and the curator of Native American art at the Montclair Art Museum. Her museum practice focuses on critical and collaborative museology and historical, modern, and contemporary Native art. Her research and publications examine visual and material culture of the Northwest Coast, as well as indigenous and intercultural dress, fashion, and textile history in the Americas. I just want to thank both of you for being here this evening with us tonight. And I think I actually forgot to introduce who I am, so I apologize. So I am Angelica Diggs, and I'm the director of the Montclair History Center. So our History at Home programs, we are meant to have our guest experts here with us tonight who will present. As best you can during the presentation, just kindly stay muted so we can give our attention to both Holly and Laura, but please use the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, we will absolutely open it up to live question and answers, or I'll be happy to read any questions you have from the chat box itself. And I promise this is the last time I'm going to mention this. If you are more than 20 miles or more than one person, please put that in the chat as well. And at this point, I'm going to first turn it over to curator Laura Allen, and we'll get started tonight's presentation. So welcome and thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Angelica, and so great to be with both of you here tonight, and many colleagues on the line as well. So to begin, I respectfully acknowledge the Lenape homelands that I'm speaking from today, and affirm the ongoing relationship of Lenape people to this place, Lenapehoking, despite a history of genocide and displacement. In our work today and every day at Montclair Art Museum to collect, steward, and present Indigenous art, we strive to be accountable to our colonial past, build ever stronger bridges with Native people and communities, and center Indigenous priorities in a long-term process conducted with care. So I'd love to thank Angelica, Erin Benz, Holly, and all the people who have made the effort to organize this evening's presentation. So I've been excited about this opportunity to speak with you about ongoing research work at the museum that I'm doing, looking into its collection history of Native art of North America. And the particular slice of history that I'm going to share tonight, before Holly proceeds after I talk, the particular slice of history will focus on regional and diasporic Native art and artists. And this is a history that's largely been overlooked or overshadowed on the East Coast, generally speaking, and even at this museum as well. So I'm going to focus for about 15 or 20 minutes on how Montclair Art Museum has and hasn't in the past engaged with Indigenous art practices that are grounded in this place. And not only Lenapehoking, this is a region that stretches from southern New York and western Connecticut through the entire state of New Jersey and into Pennsylvania and Delaware. These are the places the Lenapehoking are now known as, but remain always Lenape land. Also, I'll be talking about regional areas such as upstate New York, which is Haudenosaunee land, Long Island and the Shinnecock Nation there, and the Wampanoag of Massachusetts, Eastern Massachusetts. So art from artists working from these communities are all art that we've recently brought into our collection and are continuing to make strides on acquiring and displaying. So this research offers an opportunity to really recognize and honor the rich regional art histories and contemporary practices in this area. And I'm going to be focusing quite a bit on the work of a mid-20th century artist. He's a very interesting and dynamic individual whose name was Thomas Dorsey, and this institution worked with him in the mid-20th century. He really deserves more scholarship on his output, and so tonight's talk is a way to get some of that started. And I'll just emphasize that given the long history of European colonization on the East Coast, local and diasporic Native people and their arts across time have been prioritized much less in museum exhibitions and scholarship on the East Coast than the art and culture of Native people of the West. And as Dakota scholar Philip Deloria puts it, Native people are often almost always framed in terms of their pastness. And so tonight's talk is a way to bring contemporaneity to this history and show how the museum was attempting to change that bias in the mid-20th century and the work we're doing today. So yes, I'd like to just preface this by saying the reason Holly and I are both here tonight is that we're working together on a really exciting commissioned project that will be unveiled next fall in 2024 when we open the reinstallation of our historic and contemporary Native art collection. And so after I talk for a little while, Holly will pick up and share about her practices. And then we'll talk together for a few minutes and take a moment to answer any questions that you might have. Okay. So Montclair Art Museum was established on Lenape land in 1914 as one of the first US museums devoted to collecting American art. Our very founding was built on the idea of stewarding and displaying two parallel collections, one of Native art and one of non-Native art. And works from those two collections have always been a part of the institution and always been on view in both dedicated gallery space as well as integrated exhibitions. The integrated exhibitions started around the 90s, I would say, but from the very outset, Native art has always been on view, which is a bit unusual for an art institution. So Montclair resident Florence Rand Lang was one of the museum's founders, and she gave a major gift in 1914, as well as some bequests later of several thousand Indigenous art objects that her mother, Anne Valentine Rand, had assembled, and that Florence Rand Lang had expanded significantly. And as I mentioned, Lang had stipulated that these works always be on view. So another important part of the museum's mission was to promote artists from Montclair and broader New Jersey. And so the irony here is that this local mission in 1914 in the early 20th century did not apparently include the work of living Native artists working and living locally in the region, or artists whose ancestors had been displaced. So in the early 20th century, around the time the museum was founded, there was a pervasive settler fascination with indigeneity in order to help define a distinctive American identity. And so at the museum, despite this great effort to put these collections in parallel and on view, the collection emphasis was nonetheless embedded in a presumption of loss. So the assumption was that there were very few Native people here in New Jersey or the New York metropolitan area. And this couldn't be further from the truth as it is today. At the time, New York City and New Jersey had a thriving community of Native people and artists. from many nations, communities that continue to this day. So the initial collection of work at MAM represented largely the work of artists that were living further west, Native artists who were living further west. So for example, the collection, stewards beautiful baskets and extraordinary regalia from Northern California, carvings from the Northwest coast, and ivories from the Bering Sea region, among many extraordinary works in that initial acquisition. Another interesting fact is that the initial collection in 1914 also included a collection of about 1,000 worked stone tools, such as axe heads and projectile points, stone pendants, and pottery shards that were excavated from Essex County. And these were donated by Herbert M. Lloyd, who was the Montclair manager of the Geological Survey of New Jersey. And this is an image of Holly a couple of months ago examining these for the project that we're working on together. And so it's been so exciting to have these special items emerge from storage and have a place once again in the museum's display. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this image, I love this image because I think it shows very much some of the focus of the early museum collections on work from the West. This is a totem pole that was carved for the art market by a New Chalmers artist, and it was acquired in 1917. And this is a work that we're going to bring out again in our reinstall next year. So it'll have an entirely new interpretation, but I think it's significant that it's been part of the museum fabric for so long. Still, the sort of practice of exclusion of Northeast Native artists was not something that our museum alone was doing. Most museums on the East Coast were also doing the same thing. And in that initial collection from Florence Rand Lang, there was only one Haudenosaunee object. It was a dance rattle that was accessioned in that initial acquisition. And that for many years remained the only work until later. So Florence Rand Lang passed in 1943, and through her generous support and that of others, the museum created 2 funds from which to purchase contemporary art. And so that contemporary and historical art that would expand the collection. And this, was around the time of the post-war boom, when American identity was once again important for the nation to shape and define. And Native arts in the mid-20th century were really experiencing a resurgence due to a range of museum exhibitions and capacity investment by the US government. And so it was in this climate that the museum was able to finally expand some of the range of Native works in the collection. So a person who was really important in that process in the mid-20th century was Thomas Dorsey. And this picture here from a newspaper in 1958 shows him working in his studio in Hackensack. He was also known as Tom Two Arrows. That is the name that he used often for his art practices and his performances. He was born in 1920 in New York State, and he was active as an artist and cultural steward during this mid-20th century time. And this, this time was pretty turbulent sociopolitically for Native people. While Native art was very much in vogue for museums and in design industries, it was also a time of ongoing and intensified racism and discrimination and assimilative policies, with the termination termination policies. This lasted from about 1953 to 1968. And these policies sought to reduce support to Native American tribes and terminate their protected status. So it was in this challenging climate that Dorsey was working, really trying to vigorously promoting Native visibility and sovereignty through his efforts at education and promotion of Native values. So I have another picture here of him performing in Southeast Asia for the State Department, or hired by the State Department in 1956. So he was born on the Onondaga Reservation south of Syracuse, and he spent his early years there. Then he moved to Albany with his family and graduated from Albany High School, and he trained at the Albany Institute of History and Art. He indicated that his cultural affiliation was Lenape and adopted Onondaga. And he worked in a diverse range of capacities, including as a painter, a book illustrator, a textile and home furnishings designer, as a curator and a museum professional, and also as a speaker, educator, and as you see here, as a dancer throughout his career. And several exhibitions of his work have been mounted, but much of that has actually been posthumously. So in 1951, he moved from New York City to, he had been there creating murals for the American Museum of Natural History. And he moved to Hackensack and he set up a studio there. And he caught the attention of the Montclair Art Museum's new director, Catherine Gamble. And in the following years, from about 55 to 1966, the museum purchased 6 watercolors from him. And I'm going to show a few of them here. This one is a particularly large and beautiful work that depicts an eagle dance. And you can see his design sensibilities really showing through, and influences from modern art practices, as well as Native painting practices that were also becoming more popular at the time, grounded more in the Southwest. But he was one of the few artists of Northeast heritage working at that level and working with institutions broadly. Let me show a few more. This one I just recently found in the collection. I didn't even know we had it, which was always very exciting. And I've been here at the museum since 2021, and there's still so much to learn and discover. I find his work very balanced and visually strong, and it's also a serious reflection of cultural values and practices. So most of these works that I'm showing you now highlight his knowledge and participation of Onondaga cosmologies, dances, games, and other ceremonial practices. And they don't really show, they don't communicate Lenape, his sort of Lenape roots. They're really grounded in Haudenosaunee epistemologies. I think what's really important to acknowledge is the contemporaneity of the practices that he's highlighting, not only through his deployment and adaptation of modernist painting styles, but because he activated these practices and values through his own performances and professional activities. As you see here, really stressing fancy dress and cultural specificity of Native practices to resist assimilation at this challenging time in history. In 1958, he remarked to a New Jersey newspaper that television and Hollywood are my pet gripes. I try to explain the difference between Eastern and Plains and Western Indians. And this statement, plus a number of statements he made on the sovereignty of Eastern nations, really emphasize his dedication to correcting erasure, narratives, misinformation, and biases about Indigenous cultures. These are biases that still persist to his day, so his work has ongoing relevance. So in 1955, Dorsey worked with Marion Reagan, who was MAM's then curator of collections in an artistic and advisory capacity, to redesign and reinstall selections of the permanent collection of Native American art in an upstairs gallery at the museum. So according to records, he collaborated on aspects of the installation and created the designs that enhance gallery backgrounds and walls. So here is on the right an image of Dorsey in front of that exhibition in 1955. And this is a display of Plain's work. And on the left, there's an advertisement highlighting the fact that he was planning to dance in Milburn and bring cultural education to local New Jersey. This picture, a little bit blurry, but on the background, it's the same exhibition as the other display. This is actually the display of Eastern Woodlands work, which has objects that remain in our collection, and many of them were actually, several of them were collected by him as well, and I'll show you a few of those in a minute. And so you see the educational supervisor teaching in this space, and on the upper left, in the center, there's a blue box where I've obscured something, and that is one of Dorsey's paintings that's still in our collection, depicting a ceremony that is whose material culture and representations are now restricted from display due to changing cultural protocols. And so I think that's also an informative piece of information to show how what he felt comfortable sharing in the mid-century is not considered appropriate today. And we are working with Haudenosaunee members in order to research these objects and these pictures that we have in order to ensure we're displaying the right things. So Dorsey did a number of public programs for the museum, and he also painted postcards. These are postcards in the museum's collection. The things I'm showing you are really not in the literature on the museum's history very often, and so fun and exciting to be able to share them with you tonight to just start to get this out there a bit more. These are postcards of works in our collection that are done in Dorsey's signature style. These postcards presumably were sold in the store or used for correspondence, but I think they're a real another example of the variety of his investment and the museum's investment in working with him and figuring out all the ways that his creativity could flourish in this context. So I mentioned he also did some collecting for us. There's a lot left to understand in where did he acquire these. That history is still to be done, but I think sharing talks like this help get the work out there and keep the process moving. On the left, you see is a beautiful Algonquin birch bark basket. This is made by scraping the birch bark to create these botanical designs and then soaking or steaming it in order to bend it into shape. And it's a beautiful piece. On the right is a gastoa, which means real hat. This is a fitted hat worn at community and ceremonial gatherings by male Haudenosaunee leaders. These leaders are elected by Haudenosaunee clan mothers. And so again, I'll say that all of these works benefit from further research and consultation with Haudenosaunee community members, which we are embarking upon this year. So I think Thomas Dorsey's work is a real testament to the agency of Native artists and culture bearers in museum practice in the mid-20th century, doing work to correct past biases and bring contemporary experience and artistic practice to bear on the interpretation of Native work. His paintings remain the only works in our collection by an artist of Lenape heritage, but we're working to change this. as well as broaden our collection of Indigenous art from Northeastern tribal nations more broadly. So we've recently purchased works by a number of artists. I haven't shown them all here. This is to encourage you to come to the museum now and in the future to come see them. But one artist we've been working with her name is Elizabeth James Perry. She is a Wampanoag, and she creates, she's just an incredible artist working with wampum or shell-based work, as you see her work table on the left, to create beautiful wearable art. She also works with textiles and quill work, and her work really expresses generational place-based and scientific knowledge. This is a small textile work that we acquired from her already, and she's working on a commission of a wampum-based work for our reinstallation. Again, this is the only example of fiber, a textile fiber media by a Northeast Native artist in our collection. We've also, though, purchased baskets, Haudenosaunee baskets, and gotten a donation. We've purchased a work by Nadia Mir, who's an Algonquin artist, really beautiful large work that'll be on view next year. We've also acquired photographs by Jeremy Dennis, who's Shinnecock. And those are actually on view in the museum now for a few more months. So please do come see them. They're really provocative and incisive about the history, local history, and settler imaginaries of Native people. So I'm going to hand it off to Holly soon, but I thought I would just preface this by saying we've been doing some really fun, exciting work in the last 6 months. Holly and I went to the State Museum in Trenton, New Jersey, which has a really large collection of Lenape work, not only ancestral objects like some of the stone tools that I showed you earlier, but also baskets from the 18th and 19th centuries, as well as pottery, incredible pottery, and some jewelry. And you see us here getting excited about what they have on view and working with the State Museum. Part of our work also is involving native plants. And so this is Holly and I I'm the one taking the pictures, at the Van Vleck Arboretum just the other week. And they generously offered clippings of native plants to the area, and Holly drove back to Oklahoma with a huge box of amazing vegetation that will be incorporated, as well as into the work that we're doing, as well as incorporating impressions, I would say, of some of the ancestral objects in the MAM collection. So there's some exciting work afoot. I'm going to let Holly take it from here to share about her own work, and we look forward to answering any questions and talking further once she's finished.
It would probably help if I unmuted. Thank you very much, Laura. Coming to visit and getting to go see the collections, I can't tell you how meaningful it has been, because it's objects I've never seen and didn't even know we had. So being able to hold them in your hand, I can't even tell you. I have a slideshow going in the background here. A couple of them I may have her stop on and say, hey, go back. But what these are, I wanted to share my process. I make things, it's a weird thing because I used to be thinking, well, I was a photographer, then I was a ceramic artist, and then I was a sculptor. And really, I'm a storyteller as an artist. This is one of my favorites. It's actually my children sitting in lawn chairs watching my husband and I pour, because they were so little we couldn't leave them in the house. So they put on headphones, and it was almost like an entertainment or a performance art piece while we did it. And then you'll see I say we, it's my husband and I, do all the bronze casting ourselves. He is my lifter and extra hands, because for bronze casting, it's you can do it by yourself. That's what I have built, is a one-man furnace. A friend taught me how to build, Gerald Clark, and it has changed everything that I do. I can pour a piece, and for me, bronze casting is just a means to an end to be able to make figures that when I did clay, I wasn't able to execute them standing on their tippy toes, or, you know, the delicacy that I can get in bronze. So by doing bronze, I can actually have somebody stand on the smallest foot hanging on a branch. My daughter was very instrumental in helping me break open geodes, which to me has a lot to do with this idea of land and where we belong. The next slide shows a set called Belonging. And in that piece, it's all about trying to find, that's a sense of self, where I fit. I'm from Oklahoma, Lawton, but my people have been removed 7, almost 8 times. I'm actually a descendant of 2 different Delaware tribes, which I did not realize until a year ago that it was actually Delaware. And so these pieces are made in wax and fitted to the stone. So they're not glued, there's no pens, there's no wax. They're literally balanced in the place they sit. And for me, that's what I've been doing most of my life, is trying to find that balance and that sense of belonging wherever it is I am at. And so a lot of these are, that piece in particular is 2 halves of a whole. So go ahead and next slide. So most of my work, it all talks about story. And so my mom would tell stories of her grandfather and her grandmother, and the history of, like, you don't sweep at night and you pick up your children's toys, and it's this whole caregiver and what is and is not. And those carried over when I had my kids. And I started as a photographer. And as you can see, my photographs originally were pieces that I would use to work from for sculptures. But then I started to see that my photographs began to echo the sculptures themselves. So the piece before was this lady who was, it's called Watching, and she had 2 sterling silver birds on her knee. And it's a way that she was part of nature, but she was also watching out for these little birds. And I use material as meaning. So the bronze is this way to be able to make this, but then the little birds represent things that are precious. So they're made in sterling silver. So I cast in sterling silver so the meaning carries across. And then the next one, you'll see the legs again of my son. And it was just, he was sick and we couldn't get him well enough, flu. So we are in the ER. And once he's okay, of course, the mother steps aside and the artist comes out, I guess. And he just looks so beautiful there. And so I photographed him. You can go on to the next. My children became this voice for me in a way to talk through that I didn't have until I had them. My work was always about where I am and what I saw just for me. And then having kids, it became this other way of seeing the world. And it came through very strong in my work. There's a piece called Release. So I'm always thinking about like how people work together. And so that one, it could be, how do you release or let go of something? And then this was a photograph of my kids in our very insane backyard full of plastic toys we rescued from the curb. But what I loved about this image is these 2 figures you then see again later. And I photographed this after the fact. And go ahead and go to the next slide. And this became a piece called It's a Thin Line. And it was made when my mom, she got a bladder infection, ended up dying from it, which is ridiculous in today's day and age. But she was seen as just a Native woman looking for drugs, even though she didn't even drink. And in her moments towards the end, it was this idea that she could be healed, but she would not be there. And so while we sat with her and played her grandfather's bells and faced her to the east, it was this idea of, should she stay or should she go? And she let go, which was wonderful, because she wouldn't have been there. But you can see where the photographs echo sculptures later. There's a lot of mask imagery in my work. And the masks for me represent this idea of the persona that we carry. And so for me to be strong or brave, sometimes I put on this mask to be able to go out into the world. And I think a lot of people do this. And so my son became this huge costume individual, as you will see through a lot of these images. and that mask just really carried over for me. I had done it previously, but then it really came into play when I had my kids. And so you really start to see these images play out. The bird is really big for me because I always felt like if I were another animal, and when I dream, I fly. And so for me, I am a bird. My son has always been a bear, which is kind of an interesting image to think of, like, what is your animal? This is one of my absolute favorite images I took of him. And when we did it, I said, what is the name of this? Who is this figure? And he was very clear, and he goes, it's the ghost of the dead. And it was just so haunting and poignant at the same time. And then to see some of the images that Laura and I saw of the masks or the deity image just blew me away, because it was so similar to some of the images that I had been making for years, unknowing that that was there. But again, here's another look into the studio, a couple of wax pieces. And what I love to do is, I'm in the studio now, and these things just start to build on the desk. And I'm constantly working in this round robin, and I won't cast a thing until I know all the parts of a thing. So you can go on. That was a photograph I had done of my daughter called, it was called Red. And she wanted to be a superhero. She wanted, well, I don't know if an on superhero, Deadpool, but it made me really think of this haunting image of how women have to obscure their identity to be something else, because we're constantly being judged as a woman before we're judged for our skill. And so I was like, I will definitely make you a Deadpool mask. And then she stood next to me, and it was just the most amazing image. And so from that photograph, I then created a sculpture that I referred to as mask, because again, having a daughter, and in this climate, I feel like she's always going to have to step careful or be more than to be seen as equal. So that was, you can go ahead and go to the next. And then again, photographing them in this was in a tiny apartment, which always cracks me up. But this is called Back. And one of my favorite parts is in the very corner, back left, you see this arm reaching around to open the doorknob. And that was Zoe, my daughter. But if you go to the next image, you'll see where these images start to echo one another. And this is a piece called Should I Stay or Should I Go? Which again makes me think of my mother. That one piece was called It's the Thin Line. And that was because I was laughing at something she would have found funny. And then I started crying. And I thought the line between humor and sadness was so thin. And that piece was, again, this idea of making choices in your life. Should I stay or should I go? So if you go to the next image, you'll see a photograph again. It's called the 10-Gallon Hulk. And they were just amazing images, kids at the same time, subjects, the way they moved and worked and the way I saw them. And then you'll go again and you'll see how even his body posture echoes the body posture. So a lot of these things I would pick up and see later, why did I do that? Why did I photograph that? It was just like this line through, and then you can go again, which then took me to when I first had Wilson. We had moved to Oklahoma about a year after we were in Chicago. And you go to the next, and I had made a series of cigar figures, is what I refer to them. And when I was in grad school, and it was all about this idea of the stick people, which is the story my mother told me that her mother had told her, that her grandmother had told her. And it was the stick figure would run through the woods and call your name, and they beckon you to come. And of course, as a kid, you're like, I can't get out of bed. There's a stick person waiting for me. But it was like this cautionary tale. And I know other tribes had little people and different things like that. But I took the story later, and I used a cameo face for a side view. I used the body of a cigar that a friend smoked that made me always think of little dresses, and then the sticks. And so I recreated this whole concept of the stick people as an homage to that. You have the sticks, you have the cigar for the tobacco and the sacred, and then the face was based on cameo or silhouette drawings as a way to capture family. And within this, I was trying to trace back to put my son, on the Cherokee rolls, which I'll get to later. You have to have lineage to go back. And so while I was getting names and information from my mother, this sculpture kind of emerged. And go ahead and go to the next slide. There are 62 figures that I created. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see this is the piece. It's 22 foot long. It's called Bloodline. And it was based on the bloodline of my family. And so the very first log is my children. And though I only have 2 kids, I actually had 5 pregnancies and lost 3. And when I was doing the book with my mother, what I found was she has this, I call it the big white book, and it's this ring binder that just tells all the family history, like little scraps from the BIA and, you know, affidavits from this. But she would like, well, your aunt had 3 kids, but they lost 1 at birth. And so on them, I would dip the figure in wax and bow the head as a way to honor their space on this history. And then the second log is my siblings and I, then it's my dad, then my mother, and that's why the log is split. And then it weaves back and forth until you get to the last log. And the last log is the first member of my family that was on the rolls, James Bob Jr., and his roll number is 12, where my roll number is 677. And so it was this idea of trying to show family, and the log was something that was found by my kids' school. You can go to the next slide. And I when I saw it, it looked like this beautiful, like, you know, the slides you'd see of your blood under a magnifier. And so that is why I chose that, because it made me think of that bloodline, and then the life of the tree. You can go to the next. And then the idea that then you have the life of my family, and then you have the life that lived on the log. And this was an exhibition that piece first showed at in 2015 with We Need a Hero. You can go to the next. And there again is a photograph of my son. Leads were left on after a dental procedure, and he thought he was a superhero. Go ahead. And so he ended up being the star of this piece called We Need a Hero. And it's this idea that we keep putting our kids in these positions that they have to go and save us and pull us out of whatever it is that we as a people, as a culture, have started. So there's bombs, and some are real and some are fake. And then there's paper airplanes that are folded that we actually did fold. And as they go out, they're the messages of hope from our children. And hopefully one day they won't have to keep bailing us out. I lived by a military base growing up in Lawton, so I would constantly hear this bombing because they had to practice dropping bombs in the Wichita Mountains, which is a little unsettling. This is just an image that I love. These kids are writing their own stories of hope after viewing this when it was in Springfield. Go ahead. There's a piece called Coyote and the Anguish of Mortality. And one of my favorite parts of this is the shadow that appears. And shadows for me are really big because shadows are this idea of memory, because memory is not something that's a tangible. It shifts based on light and where you are and the intensity. And then one of the things I've started doing is I photograph my work, and then I've started doing drawings based on the photographs. So I find it interesting that I'll have a photograph that I'll work from for a sculpture that then becomes a photograph and then becomes a drawing. So it's this idea of weaving in and out of the work from different views. Go ahead and go to the next. And this is a piece that I recently did. Again, you'll see those long, thin legs, and it's called Lost in My History. And for me, I didn't learn beadwork when I should have as a young person, even though we lived at the Indian school until, well, my dad taught there until the 80s, and they closed down, and I had access and I had all these abilities, but I never took time. And so part of it is I'm lost to that history until I reteach myself. But it's also, I feel like I get lost that if I'm not doing this, I'm not seen as an artist that is also a native artist. So it's this kind of double-edged sword. Go ahead. And again, you see the legs. And this was, I walked by one morning and my daughter slept in this wild way, but the colors and the shadows and the lights and the legs, and you see them in multiple pieces. Go ahead. Which became pieces like this. And this is through the years. And so this also became where, not here, but earlier, I started casting plants. And so through the years is based on the idea of all the perennials that will regrow every year. And so the plant visit with Laura was really big because now I grow a lot of the plants that I'm casting. I joke around and say I'm the Dr. Kevorkian of the plant world, but they come back next year. So they get to live forever in this beautiful place. But you'll see where I take real flowers and then turn them into sculptures using them. The next one is called Hidden Beauty. So again, a play on words, the idea of being hidden within. Go ahead. And then this piece was, I started this when I found out my sister had cancer, my older sister. And it's called I'm Still Here. And one of the things she discovered, I was doing research on boarding schools, and she had discovered she had cancer. And when she went through treatment, she said it was really odd because people she knew stopped making eye contact. She had lost her hair. And so this piece is based on the mound in North Carolina. We lived in Cherokee up on the mountain when my dad taught there. And the trees are really thick. And whenever you cut down a tree, the saplings grow. Well, I thought of boarding schools. And so if you go to the next image, you'll see where one girl is bald and the other has her braids. And my sister had the fattest braids. She hated it. But there was the stories about where they cut the braids and you'd hear them hit the bucket, and they couldn't speak their language and they couldn't have ceremony or their clothes. And the parallels between that and cancer and how it robs you of your identity and like that sense of who you are so interconnected. If you'll go back for just a sec. So the girl in the front is her going through cancer, and then the girl in the back is whispering with her fingers crossed, I'm still here. So she kept trying to remind herself she was still there. And above her are the saplings, because in the boarding school, part of it was they cut down the tree, they're trying to remove us. But even though they cut these big swaths of who we are and try to civilize us, because you'll even see the front girl has shoes, the back one is barefoot, and there's a step in the tree, the saplings grow up so that next generation still steps in and tries to rise up. And then the origami are this idea of hope and honoring of the story of the girl and the thousand cranes. You can go to the next one. So obviously I'm surrounded by children and all the colors and crayons, and this is my daughter, and it's called Let Go, and it's just the most beautiful light would come and hit them. And then the next one, because of them, I started making a piece called A View from Within Under the Skin, and these are actually made of solid Crayolas. So if you go to the next slide, I'd actually carve figures in wax, mega mold, and then I separated Crayolas, and then I cast them in solid crayon. And so this idea is when they started school, you had to have a box of 24 colors, 4 of them. And I thought about how my kids see their friends, and they never were like, well, that's the Asian boy or the black girl. It was always this idea of, well, that's my friend, and they help me out at lunch, and we open ketchup and we tell great stories. And I think that we don't see as adults how we should see like our children, where we just see the person for who they are. And so these are 12 girls and 24 colors, and there's all these different emotions within the girls. Like there's one that's like a grandmother figure, there's one that's a mother, there's one that's bald with her eyes open for survivors of cancer, and one with her eyes closed for those to remember. And then there's little pigtails and girls with bare ears. And even at the bottom, there's one who's just screaming. So it kind of covers the gamut of how we feel, even in a day. So next slide. And then this is a piece called I'm Not Your Trophy. And so again, it looks at this idea of how people are seen as objects, acquiring them as if they're a trophy. And it was, I don't think I have to go into any more on that. And this is the studio I got about a year ago. I was honored to be a resident at the Crystal Bridges Momentary. And what was really beautiful is it has super tall ceilings, and I was able to work on large scale paintings and do research. And within that research, like I said, we have the Cherokee rolls, and I'm on the Delaware Nation rolls, but the Cherokee I always thought we were Cherokee, but we're actually Delawares that were pushed from Kansas into Oklahoma and placed on the Cherokee rolls. So we're Delawares of Oklahoma, tribe of Oklahoma from my great grandmother, and then through my great grandfather, we are Delaware Nation. And this is a piece that I started while I was there. That is, my kids are always asked, how do you carry your culture? Which I find is an odd thing because nobody asks an Italian how they carry their culture. And so the bag is beadwork from a bandolier bag. And I flipped it and created a design pattern. And then the photograph is of my daughter, if you'll go back. And on that, you can see where she's carrying these animals. And I think of that futurism that we always talk about in Native art. The futurism is our kids. I love everyone's take, and mine doesn't have a sci-fi effect. Mine is just the idea of that next generation. And so the stuffed animals are these representations of the animals and the earth and how we care. So still working on that. I really love that piece. Go ahead to the next. And talking about caring, again, this is a piece that's called Bloodline, Keeper of the Seeds. It's this beautiful 8-foot log that's twisted, and all the figures are women, and it's generational because as we were removed, we would carry seeds in our skirts, or you'd bring the food trying to regrow it in each location that you lived. And if you'll go back, so it's also women were the ones who kept the seeds for not just plants, but also how the stories were carried, or rituals. And then you also carried your own children. So it had a multifaceted, and I love the front, the shadow looks almost like a dragon. But go ahead and go to the next. So one of the things in all this research I look at is, again, like Laura had said, a lot of people feel like the Delawares, the Lenape are gone. And this is a piece that I started working in. I do a residency starting in October in Santa Fe at II, specifically in glass casting. And it's this idea of casting in the void. And I feel like we're here, but we're unseen. And I also feel that sometimes as just a person, a woman. So it has a couple of meanings. So this is actually hinting at some of the work I'm doing this fall. And you can go to the next. And this is my studio view. We have a pool and a trampoline. We do it right in the country. We don't need a diving board. That's my daughter. And then go ahead and go to the next one. I think that's it. And there's a piece I've been working on, and it's called 7 Sides of the Self. And again, it's just a beautiful studio view. So that's all I've got.
Well, thank you. Every time I see more of your work, I'm just I get more and more excited about your range and depth. And I have one question for you before we take a question from the audience. I know we've been talking a bit about how your work is, you're sort of expanding ideas around your work. Maybe your work itself is expanding, and you've been spending a lot of time on the East Coast lately. And so I'm wondering if you could say anything more about, you know, what you're thinking lately about where your work is headed generally.
Yeah, because we talked a little bit about it the other day. What I really love is coming there. Like, I actually didn't know. Laura was serious when I visited, because I was like, I just pop into places because I drive a lot. And when she asked me my opinion, it was like, well, I could do this and that. And then it was like, yeah, that would be awesome. But I'm seeing this idea of how what I do in one material, whether it be bronze, photography, plants, gardening, glass, all of them, they all kind of intermingle. And instead of it just always being this one little tiny thing, I've been really excited about the scale. And I've always wanted, and I have a 10-foot tall sculpture I did in undergrad, and this, 7-foot thing I did in grad. But then when you get out of all that, your ability to do that again is really hard to do. So what I really love is, in my travels, I've been able to see how that can happen again and scale up. And for me, when I visited a few different places, I like, just like my bronze work, to be original. I want to know about your place and what you're doing and what your institution's about. And I'm really enjoying working with that history and what's in the land and what's around and what was there. And so it's like a specific thing about a place. So I don't know if that was right, but I'm really loving it.
I just want to also say thank you to both of you. And there's just an outpouring of emotion about the artwork, what we've learned tonight. I think people are so appreciative to see also, Holly, what you are creating, and so excited to see more of your work. It was a very emotional chat group tonight, so we're all connecting with that. So we really appreciate your vulnerability as well and sharing with us. I do want to open it up for discussion. There's been a lot of comments in the chat, and forgive me if I missed a direct question. Anyone can use the chat, or if you'd like to just unmute or do a hand raise, feel free to unmute and jump in while we have Laura and Holly with us for anything you would like to know more about. I'll give it one moment, and then I'm just scrolling up while I'm giving it a moment to check if I missed anything from earlier. And we did have some people answering questions in the chat, so I appreciated that as well. So there was a comment from Jennifer Lay. Laura, I think this was pertaining to your presentation regarding the artist you shared with us tonight. His work looks much like Oscar Howe's, same time period, wondering if they were aware of each other. You would think so, but it was the 50s. Do you have anything to add to that, Laura?
I'm sure they were, Jen. Great question. In looking at some of this research, around the time that Thomas Dorsey was working with us and we were showing some of his work, we actually showed a traveling exhibition of native painting mostly from painters working in the Southwest. And Oscar Howe's work was a part of that. And as a result of that exhibition, we purchased one, and that's the one we now have and still have in our collection, and was recently in the Oscar Howe exhibition, a retrospective exhibition in New York City, as well as the Portland Art Museum. So yeah, I think, Thomas Dorsey was pretty well known in his time, but I think he still was a bit overshadowed by the Southwest schools of painting. That I think a lot of artists at that time were definitely in dialogue and working towards similar goals to reset how Native art was being perceived and expand its reach. So
Oscar Howe was actually Dakota, or he wasn't, yes. He painted in that Southwest style, but he was from the Dakotas. It's interesting, Laura,
he was the only artist in that show that was not from the Southwest.
Right. But I had forgotten that MAM had bought that painting. So that is interesting. And sorry to interrupt.
Well, likewise.
I also had a follow-up question as well, Laura, to you. In the history field, we of course also encounter underrepresented narratives, previously inappropriate interpretation in spaces, and how we correct those stories. So someone like me who is less familiar with the visual arts field, and you mentioned that about some of Thomas Dorsey's work, how can we learn more about that? And that may be a follow-up resource question we could always share with the group. I'd be interested to understand that as well in terms of the visual arts and to learn more about it.
Yeah, certainly. And Thomas himself, there's a few segments or chapters that highlight his dance choreography and his dance work, and a couple, I think there are some publications related to exhibitions, but I think that there's just more work to be done. And that's the part of, like I said, being able to do talks like this. It just gets the information out there. There's a couple of other institutions that have a significant number of his works, not only painting, but also material culture, dress objects, like moccasins he made, and other types of works. Like NMAI has a number of pieces, and the Philbrook has a number of paintings. And so I think this is kicking off some greater interest in getting this work out of the archive and maybe stimulating more scholarship in the future. But I'm happy to look at resources that look into that mid-century period more broadly that might be of interest to share with this audience. So let me know.
Thank you, Laura. I want to make sure if there's anyone who's waiting, who's not percolating in the chat, who wants to just unmute or ask a question, just jump on in. Holly, well, I have a question. So I'm gonna go ahead and ask. Holly, so much of what you shared tonight, I'm curious, your children get to see and experience the artwork you're creating. You said, like, for example, I loved the example of it felt like a live performance when you were doing bronze casting. Wondering about maybe your children's reflections on seeing you create the work and maybe how they connect to their own culture. I mean, that's a very loaded question. But because you also stress too, we don't often see things the same way a child might. So I was just curious to know a little bit more of that.
They're that's a weird thing. They're very relaxed around the studio. I mean, I have a whole enclave of photographs I'd take of them sitting across from me. So to be able to work, as crazy as it sounds, I would like drag stuff into the studio so they could sit, but they always wanted to be with you. So I have sculptures that my son made, and it was very, what I love is there's art with a capital A, and then there's art, and they were never afraid of anything because they were with it all the time. So for them to walk through a museum or to see an exhibition, I used to love, because they'd be like, that's me, at a show where they'd see themselves, or even a sculpture that I'd have them pose for. They were very much like, that's me. And it was every day. And so, like, my daughter is a painter and into printmaking and story creating, because everything always had a story. And then my son does stories and is a musician. And for a little while he did sculpture, but he really has leaned into the making of music and sound. And so what I love is for them, this creative world affected them so much that that's their world as well, but with their own flavor and take and taste. So I say they're the most traveled and well art educated kids, probably in all of Oklahoma sometimes, because that's all we did. Is when we would do trips, they would go and we'd go see museums and see things. I mean, they saw Lucian Freud on one coast and Candy Wiley on another, and museums in between. And like I said, they really enjoy it. So I don't know if that was
no, I
a great answer.
It was, yeah. I see a hand raised from Michael. Do you want to go ahead, Michael, and unmute?
Sure, thank you. This was an amazing presentation by both of our speakers. I feel very fortunate that I was able to observe this evening. Holly, I had a question for you. What our museums, or what should museums be doing to work more collaboratively and effectively with members of the Native American community? I'm thinking in particular about what we're trying to do at the Montclair Art Museum. I'm a trustee there, and I'm also co-head of the Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. And I know we're mightily trying to do that.
Well, I think, thank you. Yeah. And thank you for your comments. I think a big thing is not just, there's always the land acknowledgement, but I think it has to go farther. And I've said this before, it's like, how do you bring in artists that are first originally from the place that your institution is sitting on, and engage with them? And Laura has done a great job with that, where I've been invited in to see collections, but then it's also been like, what kind of work with y'all are redoing your collection or your space? I don't know how to phrase that proper, but she's working with somebody who is originally from that area. And so, and if it isn't even that, it's like being able to bring people in that would have education, and maybe they can teach something to your community. So bring in outside speakers if it's not something that you could do on a large scale, where maybe you're bringing in language or traditional art or contemporary, and that's a real loaded word there. I'm going to acknowledge that, because it's everything all the way through time is always evolving. But don't get stuck in that jar with the beads thinking this is the only thing that's native. I mean, there's such a vast realm of artists that are out there. And if you don't know somebody, ask somebody. And another thing I would say is I love when somebody can go, here's this person, and they have a really great name. And then they go, and then here's another person who's emerging. And so that you bring up that next generation that's doing things. And I think that is really big, because each voice is going to be different. Each way of looking is going to be different. And that way you don't discount one for the other, but you go, here's this and here's this. And you give visibility to all levels. So I don't know if that helped, but that's my take.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that too, Michael and Holly, you know, in the history field as well, land acknowledgement is so important. And it's also about how to connect and make these stories heard and visible. So, you know, it really translates across all sorts of borders in the humanities and how we can show that and express that. So thank you, Michael and Holly, for that question. Anyone else want to unmute and ask anything before we wrap up this evening? I just want to.
I have a question for
Sorry.
Holly.
Oh, great, Marianne, go ahead.
Yes. Holly, what are the approximate sizes of your casted figures?
Oh, well, here was one I was messing with while I was talking. My work can be, I know it sounds terrible, but I work in anything that's like this scale to like this scale. I've done bigger, but the reason was actually what would fit in this little tiny kiln, which I didn't show the slide of. I always laugh and say it's my meth lab because it was this little rickety cart that had this tiny kiln on it. But I like the scale because like my crayon figures are only 4 inches high. So what's wonderful is I can do something very tiny and small, or I can do 144 or 288 and it becomes something massive. So they range. I think a regular figure that I do on average is like 8 inches in height.
I appreciate the fact that you do your own casting.
Yeah, for me, I don't do additions or molds. That's a big thing everyone does in bronze, and more power to them. But for me, each piece is its own story. And so I have faces that I like to use again, and I always alter. And if I do have molds, don't get me wrong, but they're all of my own pieces. So I'll make a sculpture and I'll go, oh, I love the body on that, or I love the position, or I love the arms. And so then I make molds of them so that then I can like not have to reinvent the wheel every time. But then they get altered and changed to become whatever it is that I want that story to be. And like I said, I don't even cast until I understand where it will stand or how it will be or what will happen. So like Bloodline, I worked on for 9 years. And it's not because it took me 9 years to make it, but all the story was not figured out for 9 years. It took that long. And so, you know, everyone's the favorite question of an artist is, how long does it take you to make that? I'm like, well, in real time or in like actual time? Because it has to have a whole thought to be a finished thing. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.
Someone in the chat just mentioned, Holly, that your work is on view at the Art Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
I was also going to ask too, when artwork is potentially coming to the Montclair Art Museum of yours. And sorry if I missed that earlier.
That's a Laura date.
So we're opening the reinstallation of our Native American art collection in September 12th, 13th, 14th, maybe that whole week of next year. And so Holly's work will be really integrated with some of the architecture of our spaces, and not just one piece. It'll be distributed, I would say. And so you'll be able to see that once we unveil the entire reinstallation about a year from now. Although hoping we can buy a photograph in the meantime. So maybe there'll be a smaller piece that'll come sooner to our collection.
It's really exciting. I know this entire group is going to look forward to that exhibit when it is on display. Thank you so much, Laura and Holly, for sharing all this with our group tonight. Thank you, everyone who's still with us this evening. We are recording. We plan to put this presentation up on our YouTube channel. We'll share it with everyone who registered this evening, as well as on social media, because there's so much to learn, and we want those who perhaps couldn't attend tonight to learn more as well. So thank you both so much for your time. I'm truly looking forward to this exhibit next year as well.